Hey, nice to have you in, and you are marking International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, and you'll hear various references on RNZ, I'm sure, throughout the day to that, but you're using it as a bit of an excuse to look at the way women treat their money and particularly how they invest.
We got in first, Jesse.
Yeah, great.
Yes, on Women's Day tomorrow. Yeah. Yes, I've been watching the differences between how women and men invest and handle their money for years. And the first thing to say is that there are heaps and heaps of exceptions.
Yeah.
Of course, there are many, many women who run money like a man and many, many men who run money like a woman.
Yeah.
But over and over again, research finds sort of significant differences, gender differences. And so, and I think that in itself doesn't matter except that it's interesting, but there's some quite thought-provoking stuff about how women might do it differently. And perhaps, is there an International Men's Day? There must be. When that comes up.
It's funny you should ask because it's a question we get asked many times in the text during International Women's Day.
Is it?
I don't think so. I don't know. I can look it up.
Well, we'll look it up, and if there is one on that day, we'll...
I'm sort of replying tongue-in-cheek, although I have done a couple of really interesting interviews in the last year or so from people who say, hey, it's possible to care about the rights and progress and actualisation of women and look at the ways in which men are suffering and might be helped along as well. But yeah,
absolutely,
might not be quite mainstream, that one yet.
No, but it's there. And you know, what I'm going to say today is certainly not all women are doing it wrong and men are doing it right, because that's not the case. But so to just look at a few interesting differences that I've noticed in the research over the years, ASB has found in some research that women are more likely than men to have a savings account and to have $600 or more in it. And so they do that well, and more likely to have $10,000 set aside for emergencies. So, which is interesting. Possibly partly because they tend to be more in charge of the children and more, I don't know, whether they're less likely to live payday to payday, to miss payments, and to fall into unarranged debt. So that suggests that women are pretty good at running, or better than men on average, running the day-to-day money.
That's pointing to sort of maybe a bit of risk aversion and maybe a kind of a focus on security.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, that makes sense. But on the other hand, the FMA, some research that the Financial Markets Authority's done says who doesn't know what kiwisaver fund they're in, it's about 10% of men and about 21% of women. So women are twice as likely to not know which kiwisaver fund they're in.
Is it possible that men just say they know which fund they're in because they're too
of course it
embarrassed?
Of course it is.
I wonder if they follow up that question with, all right, then, which one is it?
Yes. But there's probably quite a few women that would do the same thing.
It's like when they ask men, are you qualified to do this job? And men say, yes, I am. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's actually true.
No, well, quite. It's the FMA also found, once again, they could be making it up, but men are more likely to read their KiwiSaver annual statement and check whether they're on track to reach their goal. That once again is self-reported, I'm sure. But that those tendencies seem to be there. And then the Retirement Commission did some financial knowledge questions, and so this one's a bit harder to cheat on because you had to answer the questions. And they found 30% of men got them all correct and 15% of women. So once again, the men seem to be sort of twice as good at these sort of things.
You and me must be overdue for a quiz in this segment, Mary. I like when you do quizzes.
We did one last time, but you weren't here.
Oh,
you were
really?
Off that week. Jesse, yes, sorry. Well, we'll have another one soon.
Okay.
Yeah,
love a quiz.
Yes, we did. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So this is interesting, the sequence here. 30% of men got all the answers right and 15% of women. But when they looked at young people, they were about equal. The women and the men were about the same at the beginning. Now, everybody tends to get better with their financial knowledge through life, which of course is what you would expect. Yeah. But men increase their financial knowledge faster than women do as they get older. And so by the time you get to, older age groups, there's quite a big difference in the financial knowledge of men and women. But interestingly as well, single women with no children did better than women in relationships, which I suppose is not surprising. It's the same message that women in relationships are tending to let the guy do the money, whereas women on their own have to get on with it themselves. And
you do. I think we might have talked about this before. You do kind of hand over responsibilities in a relationship.
Yes, you do.
You'll be the putting rubbish out person, and I'll be the hanging washing out person, and
that's right.
And maybe more often than not, they do end up being split around gender lines. But
yes, and most of that doesn't matter.
No.
You know, if
people are happy with the split.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, and by tradition, if men are more likely to put the rubbish out, and the women are more likely to cook the dinner or something, and everybody's happy, doesn't matter. But finance does matter because you get women who are, well, sometimes I've known of women who've been stuck in a relationship that they really should leave, but they just don't know anything about the money, and it's all just too hard, and they're so underconfident that they don't leave for that reason.
Yeah,
it's awful.
So this younger generation, though, maybe that's a sign that the idea of financial knowledge is becoming less gendered?
It could be.
Yeah.
It could
you
be.
Hope so.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Looking at retirement and the money that you've got at retirement, some ANZ research found that women's kiwisaver balances were about 28% below men's at retirement. So, for example, if the man's got 100,000, the woman's got 72,000, which is a big difference, and that's quite worrying. And it's put down to having lower pay. Women still tend to have lower pay than men after you've adjusted for all the different things you should adjust for. Women are more likely to have time out from the workforce, and women tend to take lower risk with their investments, and therefore they don't grow as fast. And we'll get onto that again in a minute. But looking at the retirement money, so women are going into retirement with less, and they tend to be retired for longer because they tend to live longer. And so not only have they got less money, but they've got more years they've got to spread it over. Now, there's a couple of other interesting pieces about women's attitudes to money that I found. I thought, oh, help, really? AUT focus groups, they observed that if an older, confident white man is in the room, women defer to him even when he's saying something totally wrong. Yeah, that was one.
And that's why every day is International Men's Day.
Yes.
Because we get listened to even when we're talking nonsense.
Yeah, well, and I think I've seen that myself and possibly joined in, and thought, if someone seems very confident they're right, it's quite hard to challenge them unless you're absolutely sure they're wrong. And then some Aussie research on healthy relationships said women tend to show love and trust by deferring all financial decisions to their man. And so that's probably something to do with how people are raised. And, certainly in my generation, I would say the role models of our parents were that the woman would be good with the housekeeping money, but not the investing and not the long-term savings and so on. And, that would, to some extent, that was all right unless they got divorced or the man died or the man was just not very good at it. I had a letter to my Herald column a while back of a woman who, I think they were on a farm, and her husband ran the money and not terribly well, and then he drowned quite young. And she took over the farm and made it a whole lot more efficient than it ever had been before. And so the assumption that the woman's just not as good at it, assumption made by both genders often, can be just so wrong. So
some of this might be cultural too. I've just been reading a book about the ways in which Japan is different for one, and it's typical in Japan for the women to run the finances of the household and give the husband some weekly pocket money.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's...
According to this book.
I mean, where the usual stereotype probably comes from is if the woman's at home looking after the children and the man's actually the one that's earning the wages, that they're the one that gets the wages given to them. But anyway, there it is. Looking at investing in general, there are two major differences that keep coming through in the research over and over. One is on how often you trade, whether it's shares or property, or it could be bonds or cryptocurrency or whatever, how frequently you trade. If you're invested, how often you get in and out of the markets. And men tend to trade a lot more often than women, and we'll come back to the ramifications of that in a minute. And the other is attitude to risk. And, women do tend to take a lot lower risk than men. And some FMA research found that more than a third of women are unwilling to take any financial risk. So they just want their money in the bank, basically. And that's a third.
We've talked before about maybe that word risk not being a particularly helpful one when it comes to investments.
We have, and it's a shorthand, unfortunately. We should say volatility. It's just that volatility doesn't sort of
roll off the tongue.
That's the expression I want you. Doesn't, and not everyone even knows what it means. I think but you're quite right. Risk in this context is not, generally speaking, the risk that the money's going to disappear into the sunset. It's just the risk that it will go up and down and be volatile, and people freak out when it goes down.
Yeah,
sometimes.
Risk is sort of an antonym for security, isn't it? And so if you're focused on security, it would feel natural to avoid risk.
Yes, yes. You don't want the balance in the bank that's you're paying the groceries this week to go down. Of course you don't. And no one's ever suggesting you mess with the grocery money and start putting that in a share fund or something like that. But looking at trading frequency first, so men are much more likely to trade shares, property, that kind of thing more often than women. One piece of research just looked at trading, and they divided. It was a big share broker firm, I think, in America. They divided their clients into 5 groups according to how often they traded, and the ones that traded least often got 5 percentage points higher return than the ones who traded most often. So if you're looking at 5 percentage points, that might be a 5% return versus a 12% return. It was just clear the ones who traded less often ended up with higher annual returns on average.
And your other stats suggest that's more likely to be women.
The ones who did, that's right. Yeah. And
5 or 7 percentage points, or the 7 percentage points?
7 percentage points difference. So the example I had was 5% versus 12%.
Got it,
Yeah. Huge, massive difference. Yeah. And yes, another research found men trade 45% more than women. In one study, they concluded that almost all the difference between how men and women do is down to trading frequency. So they were about equal at picking which companies to get into and that kind of thing. It was just that the men did worse because they traded more often. And so that message to women is good on you for just getting into the right investment for you and leaving it.
Yeah. And
going and doing something more interesting. Yeah. Is it some research?
Whether by design or not, right?
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a sort of common message I try to give people, that actually if you do investing the way I think is best, you don't have to put much time into it at all, or interest. You can just get it into the right investments for you, and only look at it if you're getting closer to spending the money.
Remember when COVID happened and there was that big crash, and everyone was like, "Hey, what should I be doing?"
Yes,
there was panic,
and they didn't have much else to do with their time.
No. They're like, maybe I should be acting, and no one could kind of find the right. Apart from yourself, of course, the right advice.
Well,
but men are more likely to act in that situation.
Yeah, they were in the GFC. They were more likely to sell their shares at market lows than the women were. So women do that part well. And for men who are listening, you might want to tone down your trading.
Yeah.
So the message is, you don't try to time markets. You don't try to pick what's performed well lately and move into that, moving your money from one kiwisaver fund to another. All of that's actually negative. It tends to make you do worse. It's not just not very helpful. It's
And there's plenty of research to show that.
yeah, heaps and heaps. It keeps coming back. But on the other hand, women, it'd be really good if women were a bit braver in terms of investing in riskier or higher volatility KiwiSaver funds, etc., or non-KiwiSaver investments. There are a lot of women who say, I'll just go with the low-risk one because I don't want to take risks with my retirement money, and that's one of the big reasons why they end up with less money in retirement. There's some new data just come out from Morningstar. They put data out every quarter on KiwiSaver, and they looked at the average over the last 10 years, average returns, and the conservative KiwiSaver funds, which are the lowest risk ones, the average return was 4.3, and in the aggressive, the highest risk ones, the average return was 8.3. And it just goes on through. Conservatives 4.3, then moderate 4.6, balanced 6.4, growth 7.9, aggressive 8.3. And you often see that there's just a steady, when you look over a 10-year period, if you look over a 1-year period, you sometimes get
all over
messed.
the place.
Yeah. But over a 10-year period, you usually will see that the average return is higher. So 8.3 in the highest risk KiwiSaver category versus 4.3 in the conservative. That can mean you retire with 3 or 4 times as much. Just the return's about twice as high, but it compounds in a way that makes it not just twice as much, but 3 or 4 times as much. So I really urge women, well, everybody, to get into the higher volatility, higher risk KiwiSaver funds, unless you're within 10 years of spending the money in retirement or on a first home.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you do that, you start reducing your risk levels.
Yeah,
But,
we've done plenty of conversations on that. That wouldn't mean that you'd move it all to conservative funds. If retirement's just around the corner, you'd stagger them. And
just the money that you think you're going to be spending in the beginning of your retirement.
you can look that up on our podcast page.
Yes.
Our
We
discussions
talked a
on
lot
that.
about that. Have we got time for one more quick thing? Now, the Labour government announced a policy change that I thought was rather good for women on parental leave to do with KiwiSaver. But I recently checked with Nicola Willis if National was still going to do it, and she came back and said yes. So, and that is that from the middle of this year, new parents going on to paid parental leave, if they keep putting in their own KiwiSaver contributions, the government will put in what the employer usually puts in. Because, typically the employer will stop while the parent is on parental leave. And so then there isn't a huge incentive to keep putting your own money, and the incentive's not nearly as big anymore. So the government's going to step in and be like the employer while you're on paid parental leave. And in a way, it's kind of like the government's employed you in some ways. They're paying you some money to be on the leave, and so they're also putting your KiwiSaver contributions in. And it means you still have to put your own money in. And so it might be if you usually get a few months' notice that you're going to go on parental leave, you might want to be setting some money aside so that you've got enough to put your own contributions in throughout the time you're on leave, so that you can get the government putting its 3% of your pay in as well.
Yeah.
It's because
you're basically getting dollar for dollar on any dollar you spend, up to 3% of your salary.
That's right. And
you wouldn't find many investments like that around.
No, regardless of all of this, you were still getting the government's ordinary contribution that they give to all KiwiSaver people. But this is the government stepping in as an employer and giving you more. So, I mean, what the basic message is, keep putting from July 1 on, if you're on paid parental leave, keep putting in the amount you were putting in when you were out working, earning a wage, and then the government will put in extra as well. And when you think about it, people who go on paid parental leave 2 or 3 or 4 times, in your family's case, that can make a big hole in their retirement savings.
Well, you said that earlier, that one of the main, three reasons women's kiwisaver balances are lower than men's. Lower pay, hopefully we're fixing that slowly but surely. Time out from the workforce, which this is meant to help address, and lower risk, which is in the hands of women, really.
To get themselves into the higher risk funds. But so this is, I think, it might not be that big a deal as a budget item, but for individual people who are taking parental leave, it's really good. And if you know people who are pregnant and might be planning to, or it would apply to the partner as well, I'm sure. It would, if the dad's going to be the one that takes parental leave, I'm sure it would apply to them as well. I don't think the government will dare not do that. but yes.
Mary,
so that's
thank
some
you.
good news, yes.
Thank you very much.
Kirsty.
International Men's Day is November 19th and is a global awareness day for many issues that men face, including homelessness, violence, mental health issues.
So look, I'm going to make a note in my diary and we're going to address men.
You're keen.
On that date. That
might be a good one for me to take off. Thanks, Mary. Cheers. You can hear our conversation today and previous conversations on personal finance by heading to the podcasts page and look for Mary Holm.